Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
How did we end up so woke, and why have our institutions changed over the years, and why are some of them losing sight of the basic roles they're supposed to perform? And also, whilst we're at it, why are we rewriting history along the way? Those questions and much more on this episode of A Nation of Taxpayers. I'm your host, Duncan Barkes. Alongside me from the TPA, it's a welcome return to Elliot Keck.
Good to be back.
Almost forgot your name there.
I know it's been a few weeks. It's good to be back. Yeah,
it's good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm very well. I'm very excited for this episode, actually.
I think this is going to be a
particular passion of mine.
Fascinating episode. And we welcome as our guest Zewditu Gebreyohanes. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
A cultural campaigner and commentator, the person behind the Custodian Substack, sign up now, deputy editor of the digital publication History Reclaimed, and also director of the Restore Trust between May 2022 and November 2023, which was the campaign to kind of de-woke the National Trust.
Yeah.
That's a fair description, isn't it?
Yes, I think that is a fair description. In essence, I think what Restore Trust was about was trying to make sure that the National Trust was brought back on track, preserving the heritage in its care, built as well as natural, because they seem to have gone so far in the nature direction that they've forgotten about the historic houses.
How did you get involved, or why did you start to think we need to do something about this? What was the catalyst?
About the National Trust? Well, it all started before I joined. I mean, the Restore Trust was a campaign that was already going on when I joined it. But the reason I was asked to join the campaign and become the director of it was because I'd already worked on similar sorts of projects at Policy Exchange under the History Matters History Matters Policy Unit, and that policy unit was dedicated to making sure that institutions were being run according to their founding principles. Yeah. So, with the National Trust, with Restore Trust, founded at around the same time as History Matters started up, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests.
Yeah.
I think we were doing a similar sort of thing.
Got you. And for you personally, why does this stuff matter?
It matters because heritage is important. Without looking at the past, we can't move forward. And history and heritage I've always been passionate about. But in particular, I think after 2020, 2021, everything started to become just a bit weirder.
Yeah. Why do we think it was around that time?
Black Lives Matter certainly had a lot of influence in all of this, but it was something that had already been going on before then. So, for example, if you look at the National Trust, they didn't start doing these projects after Black Lives Matter. They just became... it just gave these projects more impetus and more catalysed things.
Yeah.
But they'd already been going on from about 2017. The 2010s, really, was when these sorts of projects started. Yeah. Highly identity politics-y.
Yeah. I'm interested as to why we see some of these organisations and institutions just leaping on this. I'm going to use the term bandwagon. Why do you think, Elliot, that they start? Why did they start doing this?
I think it probably ultimately comes down to the fact that we do now seem to basically have an elite in the United Kingdom that doesn't like Britain very much. And this sort of symbolised most appropriately by Gus O'Donnell's comments in 2011. Gus O'Donnell was the most senior civil servant in the United Kingdom, and he said that while he was in that post, he saw global welfare as more important than national welfare. And I think what's happened to the National Trust just provides this perfect mirror to almost everything that is going wrong with British society. I think for the last sort of decade or more, it's felt a little bit like the British public are sort of the metaphorical frogs, right? Where the temperature keeps on going up and you don't realise until it's boiling. Whereas if you're plunged right into the boiling water, you notice it immediately. And I think the National Trust is something I'm very passionate about. I was a member for a number of years. And I always enjoyed going to National Trust sites because they are inherently beautiful sites. Yeah. And no matter how poorly managed they are, they will still be beautiful sites. But ever since I've sort of come across Zewditu's incredible, fascinating paper and fascinating work, it has every time I now go to a National Trust site, I can see the signs and symbols of that decay. And I think you can see that in almost every part of the British state now, these institutions that we previously really, really valued. And we almost sort of left to themselves because we thought, they're really valuable historical institutions with our best interests at heart. They've been taken over by this sort of coterie of people that really actually don't like those institutions. And I think there's so many examples. I mean, the most obvious one for me is the fact that someone at the BBC decided that Sam Smith would be an appropriate event to have at the proms, a celebration of the heritage of classical music. So I just think the National Trust is this incredible mirror to everything that else is going on in our country.
There's a lot to unpack there. You mentioned the BBC proms and Sam Smith. That is really interesting. Do you think, and I think this is, and the same with the National Trust, is it a group of people intentionally going, this will really upset and hack off the people who are, maybe you might describe them as traditionalists, for example, so let's do something to really bloody their nose? Is it that intentional? Or is it, we must do something that shows a bit more inclusion and diversity, etc., so why don't we do this? How far do you think it is deliberately intentional to upset people, either of you?
I think it is deliberately intentional. I'm going to be extremely cynical. I think the ultimate example is this sort of, again, touched on very interestingly in Zewditu's paper, about the way in which actually the National Trust is viewing sites of nature as something to be allowed to run wild rather than kept in check and kept beautiful and kept pruned and weeded and all the rest of it. And I think that comes down to the fact that the traditional English garden was a way of essentially, a sort of an idealised view of nature. And many people now in our elite see that sort of that English/British attempt to, whether it's introduce ideas of democracy and free press and all the rest of it around the world, or otherwise to tame wildlife and tame nature. And I think it sees those sorts of imperial projects as having a negative legacy and therefore needing to be erased. And that negative legacy is evinced in the English attitude towards wildlife and towards nature, which is something that actually is more beautiful once it's been tamed and controlled and sort of manicured, and also evinced in of course, the many properties that came as a result of Britain's hugely successful centuries, some of which had a negative legacy, but most of which I think has had a positive impact on the planet.
Do you think it's deliberately intentional, this kind of shift?
I think so. I don't 100% agree with Elliot. I am also very cynical, but in a different way. I think it's all cutthroat, sort of financial interest led. And my big question, and I haven't been able to answer it fully myself, is why the funding bodies would be incentivising this. So that might be the sort of thing you're talking about. In terms of the institutions themselves, I think there has been a vicious circle where some of what you say is true, but it comes later, more down the line. So the initial paid management wanting to make things EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion-y, is because of the funding body's incentives. And the Arts Council, Arts and Humanities Research Council, and similar bodies have been giving quite lucrative incentives for these institutions to be getting engaged in things that are outside their remit.
Yeah, now that is really interesting. So there are people in my personal world who work in the arts, okay? I'm not going to name them because it wouldn't be appropriate or fair. But they have told me there is a situation, particularly with organisations like the Arts Council, where if you want to go and get funding, and they use the term box ticking, you have to say, we want to do this, or we want to put on this performance or whatever. And they have to literally go through a list of stuff regarding EDI to increase the likelihood of them getting the funding for, maybe a theatre building or a particular play or whatever. And this is the irony of it all. If we're talking about Arts Council funding to put on some kind of show, and you've got to really over-deliver on the EDI side of it, okay? And yet it's a show that gets put on, which in the end not many people want to go and see because it's not really appealing to the majority of people. So you have this absurd situation. I think there's something, it is related without question, this absurd situation where you're going somewhere to try and get some funding to put something on. you get the funding, but you jump through so many hoops and you're ticking so many of the EDI boxes that you end up getting the funding for some kind of show of performance. But actually, what you're putting on stage is of little interest to people. It doesn't actually get bums on seats and therefore is a failure. It's perverse.
It's probably cheaper though, and that's where I do think the commercial interest point is a very valid one, a very important one. It's a lot cheaper to put on a drag show than it is a production of the Magic Flute, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of these sort of box ticking exercises described in Zewditu's report, it's a much cheaper and much easier than the extraordinarily difficult, albeit necessary task of, for example, maintaining a series of hundreds of precious historical houses.
Yeah.
But it happens with a lot. So in my report, I make that argument that sometimes it's about bringing in money, so grants or whatever. Sometimes it's about saving money. So, for example, while they're banging on about being environmentally friendly and things, they've replaced their crockery and cutlery with sort of single-use items, which is because it's cheaper to use that than hiring people to wash up. So that's the so sometimes it's purely cost cutting. But again, it's not just with the National Trust. If you're an opera fan, I mean, I'm not a huge opera fan, but I have been to Glyndebourne and the Royal Opera House, and they put on, everyone's in black tie. Yeah. And on stage, though, they're wearing hoodies and tracksuit bottoms and trainers, and you think, okay, this is definitely cost-cutting. It seems fashionable. We're remaking it for the 21st century, but actually, it's much easier to say to people, just wear whatever you feel comfortable with on stage, rather than kitting them out in proper period costume. So I think there is a lot of cost-cutting and financial motive.
Going back to the National Trust, though, it's not been without consequence, any of this, because they've lost volunteers, haven't they? They've lost members, so consequently they're losing money. What's your take on this? Is this a cost that they're prepared to pay, or do you think they were so blinkered that they didn't see it coming?
I think the volunteer numbers thing is a very big point, and they don't want to raise awareness of it. There has been a huge decline in volunteer numbers. So there were 65,000 volunteers in 2018, 2019, and there are under 40,000 now, which is it's
a massive hit.
The lowest number of volunteers in over a decade. And it is a massive hit, and I don't think they fully understood when they were carrying out a lot of their activities, how much attention this would bring and how many people would be turned away from it, but also following on from that, how many loyal volunteers they would lose, because the loyal volunteers, they've been around for decades, a lot of them, and they love the National Trust as it was originally founded and as it was being run for very, very many years, not as it has now become as of the past few years.
And I should imagine, actually, if you're a volunteer and you give up your time freely to do something that you believe in, it must be quite hurtful to see the organisation that you supported and been part of for potentially decades, as you say, treat you this way.
And there's some extraordinary examples in the paper of a sort of austere meanness from the National Trust, where, for example, volunteers, I think one site talk about how every year they'd get a hog roast and they might get free sandwiches and just like little perks that have now been removed. And it is interesting, isn't it? It is, and you see this in lots of parts of the British state where they have these sort of, they seem to be obsessed with cost cutting, but only cost-cutting for the most often pointless and churlish reasons. So, for example, some people sort of parody the TPA as not wanting civil servants to get free tea bags, stuff like that, or free coffee. Yeah. We don't mind if civil servants get free tea bags and free milk in the fridge. What we care about is the fact that 23,000 new civil servants have been hired in the last year with no evidence of the any quality of work. And again, it's the same with the National Trust. They're willing to scrap proper knives and forks, ostensibly to save money. But what are they actually doing with that money? And it's a sort of cost-cutting without any clear purpose. And I think that's because, and I don't, probably it's not just the fact that our elites have been taken over by, woke progressive activists. It's probably also because on the other side, it's been taken over by people with purely short-term commercial interests in mind. But those are two categories of people that are very unfit to lead an organisation such as this one.
Was it the National Trust who said to their volunteers they had to have rainbow lanyards?
They were,
Yeah.
yes.
I mean, how is that justified? How did they justify it?
It was at a site where apparently there were LGBTQ links.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that, whether or not that's true,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that you should impose
No.
identity politics on your volunteers. The family was also unhappy with the family who had links to that site were unhappy with how it had been done.
Yeah.
And of course they lost a huge number of
Because I think
volunteers
most
as a result of
rational
it.
people... I mean, I had a conversation with someone who works in the NHS a couple of years ago, and he's gay, and he said, well, I take the view that if someone is not wearing a rainbow lanyard, therefore they are against what I'm about. And I was like, whoa, mate, hang on. I mean, I'd die in a ditch for you, right? But the fact that I'm not wearing a rainbow lanyard doesn't automatically mean that I'm against you. And I do think, not just with the National Trust, but in other organisations, the NHS being one of them, this kind of, if you're not full in with us, therefore you're automatically against us, that kind of cancer, and it is a cancer, that particular mindset is really dangerous. And if you're saying to volunteers, well, you must wear a rainbow lanyard, and you've got, and I'm going to be a little bit stereotypical, you've got Doris, who's been volunteering for the National Trust for...
There probably are lots of Dorises
15
volunteering for the
years.
National
Yeah,
Trust,
all
to be
right. So
fair.
there's Doris, and she's just going, hang on a second, I'm giving up my time, I'm doing this for something I believe in. How dare you tell me I must wear this lanyard?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Nothing to add to that, really, Duncan. I think you've...
What do we do about it?
can I just before we move on, can I just share? There's a quote because someone shared with me anonymously an email that had been sent from a volunteer to the National Trust leadership, and it's a very long email, so I'm definitely not going to read you the whole thing. But the National Trust are letting off a lot of staff again. They're not letting off their senior staff, they're just letting off staff lower down and trying to push on the responsibility to volunteers who are the free backbone of the National Trust.
Let me interrupt you for a second.
Yeah.
This is an anonymous email.
Yeah.
Well, you know who it's from, but you're not going to tell us, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But, I mean, is this a bit of a podcast exclusive here? It is
a podcast
the
exclusive.
inside track, all right. So
I
this
might
is...
reveal more on my Substack, but this is the first.
Okay,
Brilliant.
there
So
we go.
the context is, this is someone who used to work at the National Trust or still does?
Well, no, it is a volunteer who works at the National Trust and wrote to the National Trust leadership.
Yes.
But hasn't publicised, doesn't want their name publicised.
No, and rightly and understandably so, but they've given you the inside track on this. Brilliant. Go, what have you got there?
So, the volunteer said, even more concerning is the road now being pushed onto volunteers. There is a creeping implication that volunteers are expected to take up the slack as staffing is reduced, to absorb the roles of paid members of staff. Let me be absolutely clear with you. Volunteers are not a substitute workforce. We give our time because we believe in the Trust's purpose, but that goodwill has its limits. Yeah. Right? And it says you're losing not only goodwill, but the trust of your volunteers. It's a very, very long email.
Yeah.
But you get a flavour for, the distrust that there is.
And the real sense of frustration from that as well. So more about that on your Substack, The Custodian. Sign up now. Let's go back to the question. We know where the rot is, right? And we talked about National Trust, but it's not just a National Trust. We know it's right across the board. What do we do about it? Or is it actually too late?
Yeah, I mean, normally I wouldn't, the TPA wouldn't advocate for government to get involved, but I think it is important to say the National Trust it's not technically a quango, but it fits many of the descriptions, right? It is actually based in legislation. There are pieces of legislation which National Trust is based on. It has lawmaking abilities. It can enact bylaws in its properties, and also it receives about £20 million a year from taxpayers.
Yeah.
So I think there's a variety of options, but one thing that really strikes out to me is that it should at the very least be subject to the Freedom of Information Act, because it is not at the moment.
Is it not?
No.
Okay, and why is that?
Because it's not technically part of the public sector.
Right.
Even though it has some legislative basis for existing, it is not formally a public body. Okay. But I think there are quite a number of organisations, Motability is another one, which act effectively as public bodies and therefore should be bound by transparency rules. And I think that'd be one thing I'd look at.
Okay, what would you look at? Is there anything else here that we can, or is it too late? Do we have to accept it's gone too far?
I don't think it's too late. I think that's a very good recommendation. I think Elliot's given a very good recommendation, which I wish I had in my report. But the other recommendations in my report, I think are important. So the Charity Commission, I think, should undertake a full audit of the sites in the Trust's care. I've given some case studies. This is just a tip of the iceberg in my report, some case studies of the dereliction of duty that's happened under the current management's care. And I think the Charity Commission really needs to take a proper look, because I do think funding is being diverted, or at least time and attention is being diverted towards less important projects, while the real core work is being neglected or ignored.
And the wider conversation, just moving it away from the National Trust ever so slightly. I mean, there is this sense, it's related to what we're talking about, that certain organisations are almost ashamed of our past now. Charities that you might consider to be quite worthy to raise money for people also seem quite inclined at times to want to rewrite history, or to make the point, we're really embarrassed about this country. Is that sense of rot, is it too late to overturn that, do we think?
Well, there are lots of people that say that we've hit peak woke and that we're sort of coming out the other side of it. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's overly optimistic. But there are at least some people making that claim. I don't know what Zewditu thinks about this claim that we've already hit peak woke and that we're past the worst of it.
Well, I think as long as the funding bodies are giving incentives for this stuff to happen, it is going to happen. So again, another of my recommendations, but one that's much broader than just the National Trust, especially state funding bodies. I think state funding bodies, any incentives that's given by them for institutions to be moving away from their core aims should immediately be removed. But other funding bodies should also have a rethink about the way they're incentivising.
Yeah. So this is really interesting. It's got to be led by government, hasn't it? This, I would have thought.
Yeah, but also I just think some core principles are really important. And I think the thing that concerns me is that the more these organisations become... the one thing that probably holds back National Trusts from some of the absolute worst instincts that some people may have is that for as long as it's dependent on membership fees and entrance fees, it is to some extent required to care about what the public thinks.
Yes.
And so it has to some extent think about, okay, maybe we should actually maintain this historic site because a family is not going to drive an hour down the motorway and pay £25 entrance if it's all crumbling around them.
Yeah.
And I do worry that more and more it becomes dependent on big single funders for revenue.
Yes.
The more those big single funders are able to dictate its priorities. And yes, I think there are things that government can do to probably enshrine principles, but any change of government can reverse those. Whereas one thing that you cannot influence is the mass of the British public. The mass of the British public want these sites generally preserved in as close to as possible the condition they were in when they were during their pomp. With the exception of modern plumbing, of course, which I think everybody accepts needs to be in there.
And I mean, presumably the National Trust has a board and a management team as well. I mean, I'll be perfectly honest here, I don't know enough. Occasionally Charles Moore writes in the Daily Telegraph or the Spectator about his views on the National Trust. Yes. Do we know any sense of internal wranglings? I mean, is there an uprising within those who are within the organisation who are able to challenge this stuff, or have they all been booted out?
Well... the paid management are the ones who really pull the strings, as with most of these institutions. And actually that's, again, something that I'm not sure everyone fully understands, that it's usually, the chairman sometimes is more famous or more well-known than the director, but it's the director who has... And the trustees... are often seen as rubber stampers for what the paid management wants to do, and are only told about things months after a decision has been made. So it's the paid management in the National Trust are the ones that really hold the power.
But they will be accountable, as you rightly say, to trustees or potentially a board of some description. They should be. And
I do make that point in my report. I say, the trustees, even though it's common for trustees not to be, speak up, they should be.
Yeah, exactly. Because if a trustee decided
That's
to say
their legal
to write a letter to the Telegraph's letters page or the Times, or phoned up a producer at Radio 4 on the Today programme and said, I'm really not happy as a trustee of the National Trust of what's going on here, that would make a difference, wouldn't it? Yeah. It would cause ripples, I would have thought.
Of course.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, by the way, the council, where there is sometimes a bit of disagreement, there's a council, there's a board of trustees, and then there's the paid management.
Okay.
But the council, the paid management have effectively stitched everything up so that people can't get elected to the council who are critical of what the management is doing.
Reminds me of some political parties, Elliot.
Yeah, and again, there's also supposed to be a membership that's able to take an active role, but as the researcher explains, there's been quite a number of very disturbing changes to the way that membership voting works, particularly the system called quick votes, that I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on, but essentially gives members an option to click yes to every single proposal rather than actually having to go through them individually, which is obviously creates terrible incentives for voting.
I mean, it's a bit like if the government were to, issue a new ballot form which says tick here if you, the top option A would be tick here if you want to approve the ruling party's recommendations on how to vote.
That's a really good example. Before we wrap up this week's episode, you've got your Substack, The Custodian, which obviously after listening to this fabulous conversation we've had, hundreds of people will sign up to. It's on Substack, it's called The Custodian, but just give
free.
And it's free. I noticed that when I was reading it on the train on the way up. Just give us a sense, give our listener a sense of the kind of content and the kind of stuff that you're writing about.
It's quite broad. It's of course on my niche of the heritage world and art, history, museums, galleries, that sort of thing. And I'm trying to take a look at institutions that are doing bad work, good work, doing a bit of, I might do some interviews with people who maybe have done it well, to compare it with those who are following these incentives we were talking about. And my latest one, for example, was on how the National Lottery Heritage Fund has been giving institutions the wrong incentives. But of course, I've yet to go onto the Arts Council, so that's even worse.
I read some of the stuff about the Heritage Fund. I thought that was really, really interesting. I mean, you're doing some good work there. Let's just try and focus on the positive for a second, because you did say a few moments ago that you will look at some of the institutions who are doing it the right way or who are good.
Yes.
Are there enough of those, do you think?
Not really enough. I think enough would be all of them, basically, or the majority of them, and I don't think we are there yet at all. But I do think whenever there are good exhibitions, and this is, by the way, something that listeners or future subscribers can help with. If anyone who spots good exhibitions and good museum things, institutions that are doing it right, I don't think we should just be criticising everyone all the time. No. If they are doing it well, then.
And is there anyone in particular who we should all be supporting because they are doing it right?
I haven't come across too many of those. I mean, of course, there have been, when we were doing History Matters, there were people who are doing it well. So, for example, Samir Shah at the then Jeffrey Museum, which has now become the Museum of the Home, fought really hard not to get a statue of Jeffrey pulled down and succeeded. So, for example, it's interesting to talk to those sorts of people and see how they manage to do it in the face of so much opposition.
Some institutions can be quite schizophrenic as well. So I mentioned that the BBC had Sam Smith at the Proms last summer, but then this summer I went to see Rachmaninoff's second last week, and it was just absolutely superb. It was nothing but a fantastic pianist with a fantastic orchestra. The Globe is another one. I've been to the Globe maybe half a dozen times the last couple of years. I went to see 3 modern productions, all of which were absolutely ghastly, had horrible reviews, and you could tell...
What was ghastly about them?
Well, they were just incredibly... They were not in keeping with the surroundings. The Globe is supposed to be an exact replica of Shakespeare's 16th century theatre. And instead you have these, gender-swapping... modern adaptations with modern costumes and modern props and all the rest of it, whereas the traditional ones that I've been to see over the last couple of years, Merry Wives of Windsor on recently were all superb. So some of these institutions can be quite schizophrenic, I find, where there's still that part of them that recognises that actually a lot of the public really still value the traditional stuff, and particularly the traditional stuff in its right setting, right? You know, there's lots of theatres that, you know, modern innovative theatres that do really interesting things with Shakespeare. But when people go to the Globe, they're sort of going there to see something that is close to the original. So these institutions can be schizophrenic, I think. And I'm sure there's loads of National Trust sites which are managed fantastically individually with, you know, excellent.
But you're right. If you go to the Globe, you want to see a bit of Shakespeare as it was meant to be. I know how that makes me sound, but I'm not going to apologise for it. You don't want to see some interpretation that's set in the Bronx in 1972, do you?
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly that.
There's a time and a place.
There is a time and a place. Listen, it's been a fascinating conversation, I think. Elliot, thank you. Zewditu, thank you. Let's do the plugs. So the Substack is The Custodian.
Yes.
It is free.
Yeah.
Sign up now, listeners to A Nation of Taxpayers. On Substack, search for The Custodian. Regarding this podcast, as always, thank you for listening. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, you can find it on Spotify and on YouTube as well. If you're an Apple or Spotify listener, please like us. Please give us a 5-star review, because that helps the algorithms and recommends this podcast to other people who kind of think like us. So you can do that. And you can also send us an email about anything you like, really. The email address is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com.